So this week we're learning about emotional disorders. Last week we learned about aggressive disorders, ODD, conduct disorder, aggression, and all kinds of ADHD disruptive disorders. And so those are disorders that bring children into conflict with their environment. They're one of the most common problems in childhood and adolescence. Emotional disorders we'll talk about today, such as depressive disorders, anxiety disorders, and obsessive compulsive disorders, are also very common but reflect the other end of the spectrum of childhood problems, the more withdrawn problems in childhood. Just a couple reminders, keep doing those journals. There's only a couple left, so keep doing those so you can get your full 10 journals in. Also, I know you just turned in your case study, but another case study should be coming up here due on the 25th in a couple of weeks. And also just a reminder that we're going to be doing our final exam the last day in class, not finals week, on the 29th of November. So like I said, this week we'll be studying and talking about depressive disorders, anxiety disorders, and obsessive compulsive disorders. Some of the readings and videos that we were assigned for this week, as well as optional, were the Cole study that talked about atypical emotional development, the Murray study about the factors contributing to anxiety disorder, and also some case studies on OCD and TED Talks on depression. So some of the disorders and symptoms across childhood and beyond, it's interesting to think about because they can either have continuity or not have continuity. Homotypic continuity means that a disorder or type of dysfunction can look similar across development. So if we think about ADHD in childhood looks kind of similar to how it looks in adolescence, which looks kind of similar to how it does in adulthood. There may be some variation, but by and large, children, adolescents, and adults with ADHD are going to look a little bit more attention deficit, a little bit more impulsive or hyperactive. So the symptoms across childhood look about the same. Heterotypic continuity means that the symptoms, or what we can observe, looks different across development. And this is true of these emotional disorders, so that's why it's important to think about that. Something else to think about is how are childhood disorders related to adult disorder, and is early intervention more effective or sustained? And those are some of the questions we'll talk about in the later half of this week. We'll first start talking about depressive disorders, and the question really is kids, can they truly get depressed, or are they just sad? Do they know the difference between being sad and being depressed? And what does that look like for kids? And we'll talk about that today. Some of the history, there's been recent recognition that children could be depressed. Yes, that's true. Kids can be depressed, even very young, even as early as infancy and toddlerhood. But mostly we know that depression most often occurs during puberty. We also know that depression can often be overlooked because it's comorbid with other observable disorders. We've talked about a number of different dysfunctions in this class that can be comorbid with depressive symptoms, things like chronic medical conditions, things like disruptive behavioral disorders, things like learning disabilities. All of these things can co-occur with depression, and oftentimes those are recognized as the primary problem. Learning disabilities, chronic medical conditions, these things are often identified as the primary problem, and the mental health problems can often be overlooked. And so early on, using psychodynamic theory, which is Freud's theory, so something that's really not well validated, the belief was that kids' ego was underdeveloped, so they were unable to be depressed. But we know from rates of children and adults reporting depressive symptoms in children that we can observe that there is a relatively high rate of depression in childhood. It kind of looks like adult depression. And we often look at the behaviors as symptoms, but it can be hard to recognize, both because depression in particular doesn't have as many outwardly observable symptoms as, say, aggression. Aggression one kid is hitting another kid, we can observe it, we say that's aggression. Depression can kind of be a hidden dysfunction or disorder where it's hard to actually identify. And those comorbid disorders we talked about are more observable. The diagnostic criteria for depression is a persistent sad or irritable mood, anhedonia, which is a loss of interest, pleasure, or joyfulness in everyday activities. And so most kids are happy little people, right? They play with other kids, they're happy, even if they play by themselves, they have fun playing, they love going outside, they love exploring, they love experiencing new things. And so when we see kids who don't have interest, pleasure, or joy in social interactions and playing with toys and things like that, that really can be a strong marker of depression in childhood. And then there's also the third diagnostic criteria, which is somatic and cognitive disturbances. Somatic means of the body, so body disturbances in actual way the body functions or way the child physically feels. Cognitive disturbances are disturbances in the kid's own cognitive interpretation, their psychosocial interpretation of the world. Some of these disturbances are changes in appetite, weight, sleep, or activity. So either too much sleep and loss of weight and loss of appetite, or it could be on the other end, not enough sleep, gaining weight and eating too much, same with activity. They can have decreased energy and somatic complaints, things like stomach aches, headaches. Cognitively, they can have feelings of worthlessness, so not high self-esteem, difficulty concentrating and deciding, and thoughts of death and suicide ideation. The common depressive disorders in children, the ones that we'll be kind of talking about, are major depressive disorder, or MDD. This is where symptoms occur during a major depressive episode. MDD is considered more severe. It's a depressive disorder episode that occurs for 2 weeks or longer. The average episode is about 8 months, so this is a prolonged period of depression. The other is persistent depressive disorder, or PDD. That's dysthymic disorder is another name for it. This has lower severity, so it's not as severe, but it's longer. They may have a persistent depressive disorder where it's not as severe, they don't have as severe of symptoms, but it occurs for a longer period. They're more chronic, so this can be 1 or greater years to be diagnosed with persistent depressive disorder, and can often last 1 to 2 years. And unfortunately, children can have both PDD, so persistent depressive disorder, with major depressive disorder episodes within that PDD. So these children have a low baseline where they have this persistent depressive disorder, and then they have these major depressive disorder symptoms and episodes that occur, and then they return not to kind of more normal levels, but still that low severity chronic level of persistent depressive disorder. About 1 to 10% of children have a depressive disorder. It's more common in teens and especially females, and also higher in low-income families. It's often comorbid with anxiety disorder, behavioral problems. CD is conduct disorder, as well as ADHD and SUD, which is substance use disorder. We know, of course, that depression tends to spike in adolescence because of psychosocial stressors. Hormones are coming online because of puberty. Children are exploring their newfound independence, but there's also new peer pressures, new romantic relationships, a number of just broadly psychosocial stressors and social pressures that can increase the risk for depression in teenage years and adolescence. The characteristics of and experiences of children is that depression interferes with learning. Children are not only sad, but they're also irritable, and they often have those somatic and cognitive disturbances where they don't feel good. It's hard for them to cognitively concentrate, so it's hard for them to learn. They also withdraw from social activities and from activities they enjoyed, so they experience more loneliness and poor relationships. So because of their depression, because they feel low self-worth, because they have low self-esteem, they don't take pleasure in these normal activities, they tend to withdraw from their peers, they tend to spend more time by themselves, and so they feel more lonely. And then the psychological disturbances, the feelings of worthlessness, helplessness, hopelessness, and self-criticism, all contribute to that low feelings of self-esteem. And collectively, these all contribute to risk for school failure, social problems, and other psychopathology. And these also don't not only contribute to cognitive problems in school and peer problems, but these children tend to withdraw from the family, families being one of the most important and helpful contributors to children during childhood. And this looks different depending on when we look at that. So if you recall back to one of the first slides, we talked about homotypic continuity and heterotypic continuity. Homotypic is where a dysfunction or disorder looks similar no matter when we observe it. Heterotypic means it looks different across the different stages. Depression has heterotypic continuity, so it looks different when based on the developmental period in which we're observing it. So in infancy, depression looks more like lethargy and insensitivity to the environment. Lethargy means low energy, low affect, not a lot of facial movements, not a lot of body movements, not really responding to the environment. So in infancy, these infants, these early babies, really just look kind of unresponsive, not doing a whole lot. And this is important because during infancy, during that first year, children are forming their attachments, they are have neurodevelopment going on, and the things that result from attachment, internal working models, exploration and mastery, and self-regulation, those are developing, and so where there's early depression, that can contribute to maladaptive development of those processes. If we then move to preschool, instead of looking at as lethargy or insensitivity to the environment, during preschool, depression looks more like oppositional behavior, irritableness, and clinginess. So in preschool, these kids look moody, they look very confrontational, they look very cranky, which is hard, again, to think about. And we talked about how is these behaviors different from, say, conduct disorder early in childhood. That also looks like oppositional behavior and irritable behavior. We move on to school age. Depression looks more like angriness, defiance, and poor concentration. And in pre-adolescence and adolescence, low self-esteem, guilt, and hopelessness. So across these different developmental periods, we see different symptomatologies emerging, each reflecting depressive behavior. The developmental course is that depression can have an onset at any age, so it can occur at any age, but there's an increase at puberty. There's greater chronicity, so chronicity means that more episodes and longer episodes once there's been a single episode. So once a child has a single episode of depression, it's more likely that they'll have more episodes later in their life, and those episodes will get longer. And also that over time, treatment effectiveness can wane. That doesn't mean treatment is not effective, because treatment is effective for depression, but that can also vary. There's also risk for reoccurrence. So the greater severity, the more episodes, mild symptoms during remission, means that when a child has, again, a single episode of depression, the next episode may be more severe, or they may have more episodes. Or they may not fully remit, that means to return to average levels. They may not completely return to no depressive symptoms, but their return might be to where they have only mild symptoms during their remission. And the period in between these episodes may decrease as well. So the risk is that once a child has one episode of depression, this leads to a higher risk of recurrence. So if you have one episode of depression, you're 50% likely to have another episode. If you have 2 episodes of depression, you're 75% likely to have another. And if you have 3 episodes of depression, you're 90% likely to have another episode of depression. So it just becomes more likely. So developmentally, the more it occurs, the more likely it is to occur.